to really understand the world into which Christianity emerged, we need to think about the Roman Empire as it would have looked at the beginning of the 2nd century. This point, it reached its maximum size and in area, including basically everything west of Iran, north of the Sahara, that was at all densely populated. There are perhaps 120 million people living in it, somewhere between a quarter and a third of all the people alive at the time. Now, in the 2nd century, the Romans were really lucky. They had the succession of 5 good emperors. After Domitian, the great persecutor of the Christians, was overthrown by a group of army officers, they placed one of their own, Nerva, as the new emperor. Nerva was older and had no son. He adopted another general, Trajan, as his son. Trajan is the one who brought the empire to its absolute greatest size, but Trajan also had no son. And he adopted another general named Hadrian as his son and heir. Hadrian, the same thing, adopted Antoninus Pius, who in turn adopted Marcus Aurelius. And these 4 men, none of whom had sons, each chose their successor from the most talented, most able people in the entire empire, one after the other. Marcus Aurelius, the last of these, has a reputation as the great philosopher emperor. He wrote an entire book of his philosophical meditations, and all 5 of these were really quite remarkable men. But Marcus Aurelius had a son, and Marcus Aurelius named his son Commodus to be his heir. Commodus followed his father as emperor. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, it is about the reign of Commodus. Commodus was not a great emperor. Commodus preferred gladiatorial games to running the empire. And Commodus was assassinated on December 31st, 192, with no clear successor. There was a bit of a scramble in Rome to find a new emperor. The first died. The second, the army auctioned off the office of emperor to the one who would pay the greatest. And that didn't last long. Within a few months, 3 generals leading the 3 largest Roman armies had all declared themselves emperor and were marching towards the capital. The Civil War finally settles out, and one of the 3 generals, a man named Septimius Severus, wins. Septimius Severus was from Libya, the city of Leptis Magna, and was of mixed Phoenician, Roman, and Berber ancestry. He was a typical North African of the of the 2nd century Roman Empire. His wife was a woman of Arab descent from the city of Homs in Syria. And as emperor, Septimius Severus tried to live up to the sort of dynamic role that those 5 good emperors had ruled. His last campaign was fought in what's now Scotland. He built a wall to separate the wild tribes of the north from those further south. This is the second wall built across Britain and the further north of them. And having done so, he returned to the city of York to spend the winter, where he died. he has a family, and he inaugurates a dynasty, the Severan dynasty, that will rule the Roman Empire for 42 years. It's the only African dynasty to do so. Septimius Severus' son, Caracalla, was declared emperor along with his brother as soon as their father had died. Before they'd even left York, however, Geta had been executed along with his supporters, leaving Caracalla as sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Caracalla headed back to Rome, where he would go on to make all citizens of the empire, all residents of the empire, citizens of Rome. He's a kind of interesting guy, and if you think about it, his father was from what's now Libya, his mother was from what's now Syria, he himself was born in what's now France, and he, after being involved in a war in Scotland, he had become emperor in what's now England, before going back to Italy to take his position power. It does tell you something. All of these countries have become, even before he made them all citizens, all equally parts of Rome. After Caracalla dies, we get to what's possibly the weirdest Roman emperor, Heliogabalus or Elagabalus. He is a cousin of Caracalla on his mother's side, and he comes directly from Homs in Syria. He's quite young, and he had already been initiated into the priesthood of the chief god of Homs, El-Gabal, who was contained in a black stone, which Heliogabalus brings with him to Rome so that he can continue to worship his god, with possibly some idea of making El-Gabal, El of the Mountain, the god of the entire empire. Elagabalus had some very peculiar sexual tastes, according to later tradition. And after he had married a man, he announced that he was going to have himself transformed into a woman, at which point the imperial guards decided that just wasn't right for an emperor, killed him, and replaced him with his cousin, Alexander Severus. Alexander Severus had a great interest in philosophy. He seems to have had a very austere life. He put up statues of the greatest philosophers in his palace to remind him of their deeds, including, interestingly, Jesus of Nazareth, even though he was not a Christian. And while he might have accomplished much, he died in the year 235 in battle against a German invasion. After him comes disaster. Over the next 49 years, there will be 30 recognized emperors, probably somewhere between 20 and 50 people who attempted to become emperor. If you think just 30 and 50 years, that means about a new emperor about every 18 months. Almost all of them are generals. Almost all of the 30 emperors will fall in battle, struggling to do their best to preserve the Roman Empire, because suddenly the Roman Empire has new challenges. On the north, along the frontiers, along the Rhine and Danube River, the Germanic peoples invade in huge numbers. These are the Goths in the east, the Alamans and the Marcomanns in the middle, and the Franks in the west. They overrun several provinces completely. The Goths raid as far south as Sparta. The last evidence of ancient Sparta is destroyed by them during this invasion, and the last Spartans are carried off into slavery. They also run raids throughout Asia Minor, throughout huge sections of the empire. The Romans are not able to deal effectively with the northern barbarians because they have an even bigger problem on the east. There is a new Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, which we'll discuss in some depth later on. They have the goal of recreating the great Persian Empire that had existed before Alexander, which would mean to conquer the Romans. And their emperor, Shapur, captures and executes a Roman emperor, Valerian. He has him skinned and hangs the skin of the Roman emperor he had humiliated permanently in his palace, where it would stay for the next 400 years. These crises going on. Other problems are, in some sense, attempts at solutions. In the West, so as to deal with the barbarian invasions by the Franks and other peoples, the Roman generals ruling what's now France break off and form what's called the Gallic Empire, in green on this map. In the East, after Valerian's death, his army had escaped back to the Roman Empire. Along with them were their Arab allies from the kingdom of Palmyra, led by their queen, Zenobia. They create a new empire in the east, the Palmyrene Empire in yellow. She rapidly conquers all of Syria, Egypt, much of Asia Minor. There are other disasters going on. There's a plague. There's an increase in banditry. The economy is in shambles. In many areas, people have stopped using money because, if nothing else, money is now seen as worthless because you can no longer count the amount of gold or silver inside coins. Cities throughout the empire face the choice of somehow protecting some of their people and build walls very rapidly around themselves to protect as protection against these disasters. Almost always they leave much of the city outside the walls. The parts outside the walls are usually permanently abandoned. Cities are much smaller and much more crowded from this point on. And this crisis is thought to mark the beginning of a new era, that of late antiquity. Not only are there changes going on politically, but also in the very structure and everyday life. There are changes in art, philosophy, religion. Areas like Palmyra in Syria that had not been particularly important are suddenly becoming much more significant. And the crisis is ended, and the Roman Empire is saved by a series of very, very strong generals. One of them, Aurelian, invades the Palmyrene Empire in the east, captures Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, and takes her back to Italy as a prisoner, where she will marry a senator and have a second family. Incidentally, she was a descendant of Cleopatra. The Gallic Empire is also brought back. The Roman Empire has been politically reunited. At the same time, the Roman territory north of the Danube River in what's now Romania is permanently abandoned. The series of generals who would be saviors comes to its culmination, a man named Diocletian. Diocletian was probably born into slavery, had gained his freedom as a child, joined the Roman army, and then risen up the ranks. Now, as emperor, he begins a rethinking of how the empire is run. He realizes no one man can be in all places. So he creates a college of emperors, 4 co-emperors, 2 senior emperors, 2 junior emperors. The one senior emperor will be in Milan in northern Italy. The other senior emperor will be in Nicaea in Asia Minor. The junior emperor of the East will be at Antioch in Syria, and the junior emperor of the West will be in Trier, in what's now Germany. Notice, none of them are in Rome. This is a significant development in its own. He also declares he is not princeps, he is not the first citizen. He changes the title of emperor to dominus, that is, Lord. And he is to be worshipped not just at an altar, but when you come into his presence. If you come into the presence of an emperor from this point forward, you are to throw yourself upon the floor, and you must always remain lower to the ground than the emperor. He does other things besides that. He creates an edict that freezes prices throughout the empire, begins to try to restore the coinage. He breaks up provinces of the Roman Empire, creating new, smaller provinces so that local officials will be less likely either to seek independence or to use their territory as a base of a revolt. And he has a question of, wow, these are practical steps to prevent the crisis from reemerging. What was it that caused the crisis in the first place? And Diocletian has an answer. His answer is that it's because more and more people have turned their backs on the gods of Rome and refused to worship them, in particular the Christians. And he decides that now that he is getting the empire back in good shape, it is time to finally get rid of the Christians. He orders all churches closed, Christian property seized, and Christians executed across the empire. Most of the most famous martyrs in the Christian tradition come from these years. Finally, though, Diocletian does one more thing that is very, very unusual. He becomes the only Roman emperor to retire. Having been in power 20 years, thinks it's too long. He and the other senior emperor both step down and retire. He moves to the city of Salona, where he's built a palace for himself, and will spend his last years growing cabbages. His palace, his retirement home, is so large that later on, the city of Split, in modern-day Croatia, is built entirely inside his palace. He didn't live long enough to see the undoing of many of his reforms, though others would last a very long